This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions.
Hi, I'm Eric Grant. In this tutorial video, we're going to show you how to reupholster this Helm chair. It's in very bad shape. If you look at the vinyl here, it's cracked and even the foam is damaged.
This Helm chair came off a pontoon boat. After we're done, this is what it'll look like. We're going to show you every single step so you can do it yourself. At the end of this video will be a full materials and tools list, and we'll also show you exactly the amount of materials that we used to do this one Helm chair. Let's get started. The first step is removing the old vinyl. After removing the vinyl, we'll inspect the foam and decide whether or not it needs replaced.
We'll start by removing some of the screws underneath here. In order to remove the seat cushion, there are some screws on the bottom side as well that need to be released. Okay, now we need to remove the staples. We may be using the vinyl as a pattern depending on whether or not it lays flat. If not, we may have to make our own patterns. But the laborious task of removing staples should be done on this and also this plastic base for the helm. Okay, looks like this is a separate section, and hopefully if we've got all the staples removed, it'll just come right off. Yep, it does. They have silk film here. That silk film helps to pull the vinyl onto the foam, which is very sticky, and it also creates a water barrier. So now this came off, it's just a separate vinyl piece. Okay, this one's stretched on and it's kind of contoured to the shape, so I'm just going to slit it a little bit to enable it to come off. Now there's probably a fabric pole in here. I don't know if it's still stapled down. We're going to find out here in a second. If it doesn't want to remove, it's probably still stapled in place. So there you can see the fabric pole. You can remove this foam here. So it's stapled to the Backerboard here. So we'll release those staples, or either lift up this side and pull the foam out. I think that's probably the best approach. And again, I'm going to slit it so I can get the foam out. So I cut with a razor blade right along this piping here to allow it to open up so that I could gain access to this foam in the front, this bolstered foam. So now I should be able to pull that foam out. I think they stapled through the foam. Let's see if they did. No, they didn't. So there's the bolster foam and there's the fabric pole. So we'll remove these staples. Okay, we've got the cover off, and this is polyurethane foam, and they used silk film again. The reason the silk films all tore apart is anytime that the vinyl starts to lose its integrity and have holes, it not only eats the foam in certain spots, it also eats the silk film. But the silk film helps to pull the cover on and also keeps water from getting to the foam. Okay, we're going to remove the silkish film. This is not as light as our silk film, but it's not bad. It's a little bit noisy. I don't like to use plastic that's noisy because you can hear it when you sit on the chair. Ours is not that way. Okay, the foam's not in that bad a shape. It could probably just be redone again, but we do have some inconsistencies. Like here, there is no foam. The vinyl actually pulled it deep into the plastic base. And here there's some wrinkles and so forth, and those may show up in our end result. So we're going to show you how to replace this foam and glue it onto the base. So at first I'm going to try to just be gentle with the foam. It's probably going to be fruitless in the end. There are some staples that go through the foam at general spots. They use staples in some spots just to keep the foam in the correct position so that the vinyl didn't pull it through. This has been stapled around the base too, just to keep it in place. It looks like they didn't glue the foam to the chair at all, they just stapled it. On the bottom side, again, they stapled it in place. Now we can clean up the base and remove all those staples that we didn't pull out yet.
We'll cut the foam to size and then glue foam to the chair's base.
For this Helm chair, we're going to put 1-inch foam here and 1-inch foam around the outside. Then we'll be using a 3-inch foam here and a 4-inch foam for the bolster here. We're going to use a medium density foam. Density has to do with longevity of the foam. This is an occasional use chair. This is not a lazy boy, it's a Helm chair. So you can get away with a medium density foam. For the inner part, we're going to do a medium firmness. You can also do firm if you prefer. And for the outside, we're going to do a medium firm foam for that as well. For the seat, it's a preference. You can do a medium firmness if you like it fairly soft, or a firm foam. But again, we're all going to do this entire chair with a medium density foam. And we're going to use foam from Saorite, which is an antimicrobial foam. So it will resist the buildup of mold and mildew. So if I measure the highest point here, I get 17 inches. So I could easily get away with about a 20-inch foam here. And then if I measure the highest point at the back, following the contour of the chair, I get 21 inches. So I could probably get away with a 24-inch wide foam to cover the inside and outside of the chair. Now, we also need to determine how much foam we need. So I'm going to measure about 2 inches outside of the biggest part of the chair here. So coming around here, I need about 45 inches of foam here. And then if I measure the outside, the longest part, I'll just come around the chair.
Oops, it looks like I should have measured the center location around the back. That looks like it's larger than this.
About 48 inches there. This is the bolster, the front of our cushion. This is the old foam. And this is the seating area behind the bolster, or the knee rise. This is sometimes referred to as a knee rise. We'll measure the thickness. A little bit below 3 inches, but it compressed, so this was 3-inch foam. If you measure the thickness here at the thickest part, this was definitely a 4-inch foam. So we're going to use a 4-inch thickness foam here and a 3-inch here in a medium density, medium firmness. You could also choose firm if you'd like firm. Now we're going to use our old foam to pattern the new foam. So I'm going to trace around it. This basically causes it to be a 1/4 inch bigger than the old foam. We expect it to compress slightly, and it probably compressed while it was in its cover. So I'm tracing around it a 1/4 inch bigger all around the perimeter. The Saorite blade foam saw has a flat base with rollers on the bottom side, so you get almost a perfect 90-degree cut.
To save money, we will use this 3-inch foam and add some of our 1-inch foam to it, glue it to it, to make our 4-inch foam. So that way we don't have to buy a 4-inch sheet. We'll discuss that later on.
Now, if you don't have a professional foam cutter, you can use an electric kitchen knife that you use for Thanksgiving. It just doesn't work as well. You got to hold it perfectly straight. It'll work with medium density foams, but it will not work with high density foams.
If you use an electric kitchen knife, the blades will dull rather quickly. In fact, the one we're using here needs to be replaced. The blades are way too dull. When they're new, they work much better than what I'm seeing here.
It does work, it's just not nearly as neat as the blade foam saw. Since I had to have a 3-inch foam for the seating area and a 4-inch foam for the bolster, I can use my 3-inch foam and the 1-inch foam that I have to wrap around the Helm seat and glue those together to make a 4-inch foam. So I don't have to buy a 4-inch piece of foam. So this is my 1-inch scrap piece and some scrap piece of 3-inch that I'm going to glue together. I'm going to glue it together with our foam lock spray adhesive. You want to coat both surfaces well So there's one surface, and then here's a second. When the glue becomes tacky, it's time to bond them together. Now we have 4-inch foam. We're going to trace around the bolster or knee rise a 1/4 inch outside the perimeter, and if there are any inconsistencies, I will fair them up. So now we have a knee riser that's 4 inches, about the same height as the old one, slightly higher. And they did not probably round the edges. They let the vinyl actually kind of round it on its own. But I'm going to round the forward edge and this back edge slightly because I think it just looks better when the vinyl is pulled over it. So I'm going to use a metal lid off a glass spaghetti jar that I have punched holes in with a screw, basically. And I can actually use this on the edge, and it rounds it. Look how beautifully it does it. Now it does make a mess, and this isn't really going in the air, but if you want, you can wear a mask. So now we have a bolster that we're pleased with. Now the amount of rounding is totally up to you. At the ends, it's a little bit more difficult to carve it or sculpt it, but that won't matter. So see how rigid this is? When the vinyl pulls on that, it'll compress it nicely. So I don't worry as much about the ends as much as I do about the middle portion of it. Now this is nice and smooth, it looks good. If I sight down it, it looks even. It'll make a perfect seat. Thin foams like this 1-inch polyurethane can be cut with scissors. It's a little bit slow, but it can be done, and it gives a pretty nice edge. The foam saw is faster, so I'm going to use the Cerite blade foam saw. Now, this is a 48-inch piece by 80-inch piece, and the reason I bought 48 instead of 24 is that we needed 48 inches and I believe 44 inches, so I've got 2 up. We're looking at our old foam, which is in actually really good shape. We didn't have to use a putty knife to peel it off of the frame. If you had to use a putty knife to peel it off the frame, you could always go to your old vinyl. And we can use these patterns to pattern our foam. Now we want it big, so don't make it to the exact same size as this foam because it won't glue in the exact same spot or staple in the exact same spot. So let's say these were ripped up. You could use this for the pattern for the inside, and this for the pattern of the back side. You would cut along the seams and make it large. So this is the back foam piece, and if you lay it on top of the foam that we've already cut, look how it goes over the edge. We should not have done that, but it's easy to remedy that because the foam can be glued together and you don't feel the joints. So unfortunately, we shouldn't have cut it directly in half. We should have put this on top and determined whether we could do that. We're going to have to glue a section, not to the bottom, but I'm actually going to move it up and glue it to the top. Okay, so notice how much I have extra over here. We don't have to worry about this. This is a separate piece altogether. But here I've got at least 3 inches extra. I'm going to have at least 3 inches extra here. I'm going to just cut it roughly. Now we'll take this, since we're short at the top, which I'll roll it around, and we will glue this. Where's the straight edge? Right there. To this. Ta-da! So this is how we're going to glue it. So I'm going to turn this over so I can spray this edge with this edge and this edge with that edge. Don't worry if you get overspray on the top. Won't hurt anything. We also have to spray this edge since I had to join two pieces together. So I'm going to flip them while they're tacking up. Okay, the glue is tacked up. Now it's time to bond. We have our foam piece. We're going to take our Helm chair and position it very close to the top, but with a little bit of extra. So I have plenty of up here, about an inch or so extra, and I've centered it. And I'll be able to wrap around, and I have plenty of foam at the bottom, plenty of foam on the sides. So I need to know where to apply the glue, because I'm going to glue this to the chair. They did not do that, but I'm going to do that. So I'm going to basically make a rough kind of sketch around this. And I will glue outside of these lines, but they're basically just so that I don't spray glue everywhere. I put a line down here on the bottom indicating where that goes. Then I'll fold this up and do the same thing. More foam lock spray. I'm going to spray on this surface going outside my line slightly, and then I'll spray the chair as well. All right, everything is tacky. We're going to center this near the top, place it down. Then start our taco.
We found that it's easier to just lay the foam on a flat surface like this tabletop and roll the frame of the chair around. That gives you a flat working surface, and it adheres the foam to the glue so that it's consistent following the shape of the chair.
That worked really well. Now we have plenty of foam. We need a little bit to wrap around the bottom. So I'm going to cut some of this away, leaving about 2 inches along the bottom. This will make it easier to work with. Eventually this is going to be cut flush with the frame, but for now I'm going to leave it a little bit tall so that when I get the interior foam I can cut it at the same time. We're just cutting a little bit more off the bottom. We have way too much. Now along the bottom edge, no one's going to see this, we're going to staple this foam down like they had it from the manufacturer. I'm using my old piece of foam here, and if you flay this out, you can kind of tell the shape. This shape is probably more important than anything else because it kind of follows the contour of the seat. So I'm going to trace a little bit outside of it just to make it a little bit bigger, but I'm going to try to follow that same shape, laying it down and tracing approximately 1 inch outside of it. Then for this section we'll go very large. I should. Okay, this is the top surface, so we need to spray glue on this side, and we're going to spray glue here. Now I'm not going to spray glue everywhere here, probably just the back portion and the upper portion here. It gets stapled around down here. I'm going to start at the bottom, make sure that there's plenty of foam down there. Remember, we're going to have a board in here, so this is not even going to be visible. Then I'll go up, work my way up.
Along the bottom edge, we'll staple into the foam. This will secure the foam in place and keep it from riding up. You can easily staple through the foam. We're using a 3/8 inch long staple with a 1/2 inch crown.
We're going to remove the base of the cerite foam saw by releasing that screw. And then usually what I do is I put it on the floor with shoes on and just hold the base and wiggle, and the base comes right off.
We'll use this to cut the excess foam along the top ridge of the Helm chair. If you don't have a professional foam saw like this cerite blade foam saw, you can use an electric kitchen knife. It too will work.
Next, we're going to cut a strip that can be glued to this all along its perimeter down to the base down here. So going to the bottom edge and wrapping around the bottom. So if I measure the thickness without compressing the foam any, because the foam I'm going to put on is not compressed, it's 3.5 inches. We'll confirm that in a few spots. Yep, 3.5 inches. These 2 strips should be enough. I'm going to apply glue to them and then to the chair. Don't worry about overspray, it won't make any difference whatsoever. Okay, we'll start here. I'm going to try not to glue it here, though I did get some glue down here because we're going to have vinyl that goes across here. So I'm going to basically just leave excess foam and not push on it there so I can get it up again. And I'm going to match up the edges as I go. I'm matching up the outside edge and only really applying pressure there at this point.
This strip of foam going around the edge of the Helm chair is made in 2 separate pieces. Now, does it matter if the top is exactly centered? Not at all. So don't worry about it if the end is not at the center at the top.
Now I'm going to look on the inside and press the foam if it's a little bit off. It's not a big deal if it's slightly off. And butt it up and then pat it down. Remember, your vinyl is going to compress this, so in the end you aren't going to see anything if it's slightly off. I'm going to spray a little bit here. Whoops, I sprayed on the wall. And here. Let it tack up a little bit. We have plenty of working time.
Now we'll just join this approximately at the center position of the top. It doesn't have to be exact. And continue down the other side, just like we did for the opposite side. Let's move on. Now we need to pattern for the new vinyl for our Helm chair.
I am going to separate the old vinyl and see what kind of pattern they had for it, because I need to pattern off my new foam. I can't really use this as a pattern because my new foam changed the shape of the chair, but I can use it to determine how they did their patterning. So we'll separate all these panels. Now, one of the reasons that we take apart the old vinyl is not necessarily because we're going to use it as a pattern. In fact, we can't use it as a pattern because we have new foam, and that may be different in shape. But you can tell here, this is the back panel. There's shape in this. This has to be patterned, and you have to have 2 panels. You can't just make it out of 1 because otherwise you'll have excess fabric here. Same thing with the armband. We took that apart. It is not a straight piece of vinyl. It actually has shape built into it, as you can see by the old vinyl. And obviously the inside backrest, it has shape. And then that piece does not have any. So taking apart the old vinyl can help you determine what needs to be patterned and why it was patterned. All right, we need to find the center of the chair. So 18 inches looks like from here to here, so 9 inches. This is the center of the chair. So now I'm going to mark a line in the center of the chair all the way down the back. I'm using the clear acrylic ruler so that we have it perfectly perpendicular to the tabletop. We're trying to find the center at the bottom here. Looks like 14, so 7 inches would be right there. So now from the top line to that line down there, we're going to strike a line. All right, we hope that this chair is sort of symmetrical. It is not, though. I can tell that this actual corner is not as smooth as this corner is. This corner actually looks great. This one almost makes a very sharp turn here. Because of that, we struck this line in the middle, and we're going to pattern half the chair, and then we're going to use that pattern to pattern the opposite half. We want the vinyl to be symmetrical. The foam should compress in these areas that aren't exactly the same. We have 1-inch foam all around the Helm chair. So we're going to go with the best half. I believe this is the best half, not this side. We're going to pattern for it. So now we're going to pattern for this inside area. We're going to pattern half of this assembly, so the right side. I'm going to cut my Durascrim pattern material to the basic size, going oversized a little bit, just so I don't have so much to work with. We use a foam lock spray adhesive and spray the foam so that I can stick the Durascrim material to the foam. Don't worry about the spray on the foam. We're going to have silk film over the foam, which will allow us to pull the vinyl in place. Now we need to wait to let that get tacky. So it's now tacky. We're going to start near the center. Smooth it out, working your way around from the center. We're going to mark this center line. I started to do it free-handed, but I was like, hey, why not use a straight edge? I'll mark this right. This is up, and this is out. I'll mark center here, for that's the center line. And then along the top of the foam, we're going to mark right along the edge of the foam. At the bottom edge where it runs into the base, I'm going to mark a line here, or dashes. We will be adding only 1 inch. Now I know that seems like it's skinny, and it is skinny. 1 inch is not much, but there is a little bit off there. You can see that there was a little pucker in there. But the 1 inch will do something here that we're going to talk about right now. See all this excess fabric here, this Durascrim? If I were to add 3 inches, this would make it very difficult to work with. If I just add 1 inch, then this is going to basically sit down here without all these puckers and so forth. So I'll be able to hopefully pull the fabric down and staple it in that spot. 1 inch should give me plenty for pulling and stapling without giving me all these wrinkles that'll be a challenge to pull taut. Now here at this bottom edge, where this dash line comes here, this is where we're going to stop sewing, right at that junction here, because this strip, this later strip that comes down the arms, will actually come down. We'll stop sewing right there, and then this strip, which will go down further, will be folded back or folded in and be tucked up against the vinyl that'll be here. So it'll give it a finished look. So that's important to know, that we need to stop sewing at that juncture. So when you know that you need to add fabric for seam allowance and so forth, put an arrow and put the amount that you want to add. For this, we want to add 1 inch to this bottom edge. No seam allowance here, no seam allowance here, just to this bottom edge. Now we're going to take it off and cut it out. The chair is meant to be symmetrical, but we need to check the left side as well. So I'm going to spray some glue on that, and then we're going to check that pattern we did on the right side to the left side. Okay, so it fits this direction here on the right side. We're going to flip it and put it on the left side, and this needs to be matched up for sure. So we're going to match up the center line, and we're going to check to see whether or not it's a good fit here. So you can see here, after we have the pattern in place, the chair is not symmetrical. In fact, we have a little too much fabric here, a little bit too little amount of fabric here. but we want the pattern to be symmetrical. Here, the foam will compress in. This is not a big deal. We're going to leave this alone. Here, we have too much fabric, so what we want to do is we want to fair this. So I don't want a very sharp corner here. I want it to be a gradual turn coming into my foam. Okay, so that's a gradual corner there. We'll cut that off, and then I'll show you what it'll do on the other side. Now that we've cut that off, we put it back on the right side, and you can see it's lacking here. But this foam will compress nicely when the vinyl is done, and then we'll have vinyl that's symmetrical on both sides, even though the chair or the foam is not symmetrical. Now we're going to do the arm, the top of the armband, and it needs to be patterned as well. We're going to pattern to here and mirror this half as well and check to make sure that they're the same. So I'm going to put some spray glue on the foam so I can stick the pattern material to this. Now to cut this strip, I've got a big piece of Dura on there, but I need that because I need to follow the contour of the chair. So you can't just cut a strip of Dura. So now I know that I need to cut a strip like this. So I'm going to cut a little bit oversized. But at least we have everything covered. So I'm going to put the Dura on top going past my center point. And I'm going to start at the top and smooth the Dura pattern material out to match the contour of our armband. I'm not going to let the Dura determine the shape. I'm going to let the foam underneath it determine the shape. We want the Dura to lay nice and smooth as it is here. Now we have a good pattern for that. So I'm marking right along the outside edge of the foam on the Dura. I'm going to go long down here. In fact, I don't really have enough Dura down here, but we can just draw an arrow and add 3 inches. Do the same at the back edge, right along the edge of the foam. So there's our center line right here. So I'm going to mark that. Now what we want is we want a 1/2 inch seam allowance there. We also want a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides going down the full length. So I'm going to mark 1.5 inch to indicate that I need to make sure that I add that. So this is the outside and this is the right side. So I'm going to mark an R on it. I'm going to cut right on my dash lines. I am going to be adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this band on both sides as we discussed earlier, but I'll do that when it comes time to cut out the fabric. So I laid this on the left side and it looks like it's going to be a good match. So we're good. So here's one panel and then it comes down and it curves inward. So this is where the other panel has to be joined to it. We already have foam that's been glued together here, and I actually like the way it looks on both sides. So I'm going to be using that as my seam line to join these two panels together. Now if you didn't have that, you would just simply trace a line that looks pleasing to you. If it looks good on the chair following, you know, if you like this, so it's just even across the bottom, you can do that. If you think it looks better with a contour like this, the basic principle is you have to have a seam here between where it takes the shape change. So it has to fall someplace in this range here. So we're going to just follow the foam that's got a cut in it like this, which basically separates my two planes. Here I can see the foam, but I can't see the foam here. I need to continue this line on because we need to know where we're going to end the 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's a little bit hard to see it at this juncture. That's why I'm just tracing over it. We're going to pattern for the top. So again, I'm going to put some spray glue on this.
Allow the glue to become tacky.
Cut away the excess. so it lays nice. Mark the center line. Mark the cut in our foam, or if you struck a line, mark your line that you struck. Then mark this top edge. Out, right side, up. Here we need a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here we need none. And here we need none because this is basically going to be mirrored. So we'll cut that out. Again, I'm not going to add my 1/2 inch seam allowance now. I'll add it when I actually cut the fabric. That's why we labeled it. So the chair is upside down now, and I've sprayed the glue on the foam. So I'm going to use a pattern material again, and we're going to pattern for the bottom half. Okay, so wow, ran into this corner pretty abruptly here, but I'm right on it, so I'm good there. So I'm going to trace a line right on top of the lines for our other pattern. Outside, right side. We need a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. I'm going to randomly just kind of put lines here at the bottom of the chair because I need excess fabric to pull around the backside and staple. And then I'm going to make sure that I have 3 inches of extra fabric here because I don't have 3 inches here. I need to make sure I have 3 inches all around the perimeter here. Now we need to mark our center line. Then I lifted the chair up, and then I'm going to strike right along the edge of the foam.
We'll need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to this side. We'll do that later on when it comes time to pattern our actual vinyl fabric.
So we're going to pull this off, and we're going to check for symmetry here. I put a little bit of spray glue on that side as well. And then we're going to put this one on as well. Notice the outside is not facing out. Same thing with this one. Outside would have to face towards the foam. Okay, we've placed this panel on the left side. Outside is facing down. I've got this line has to be matched up. Okay, the line in the center. And you notice here that we're off here. We're going to trim that away because we want symmetrical panels. If your chair was completely not symmetrical, then you'd have to pattern everything. But we believe this is going to be close enough. So I'm going to strike a line, new line basically, where that panel underneath it is laying. This panel. Then here we have excess fabric. This side wasn't symmetrical with that one. So we're going to make this one gradually come into this one. And then we're going to chop it off to here. And press this foam in because it actually is not glued there. And then we want to come down here and add 2 extra inches or so because we want a continuation past this point. So I'll add 2 extra inches here. And here we need some fabric pull. We'll add 2 to 3 inches here. We're going to take them off and trim them. Okay, these two panels are sewn together. There's a 1/2 inch seam allowance added to this one and this one, but we don't want any more 1/2 inch seam allowance except for where they are joined together. So right there is where it is going to stop seam allowance. All of our patterns are cut now. They are mirrored images. We are going to be sewing channeling into the inside back panel, so this panel. So to do that, we need to cut a bigger piece of vinyl because it shrinks up when you sew channeling. So we'll show you how to do that next.
Cutting our vinyl fabric to size is next. We're using a 4-way stretch called Sombrella Horizon.
This is Sombrella Horizon. It is a 4-way stretch. We're stretching it along the width here, and we can stretch it along the length, and like all fabrics, along the bias it stretches. And on the back side, it has 100% polyester tricot backing.
You'll find gorgeous colors of the Sombrella Horizon fabric at the Serite website, and many of those colors correspond with the Sombrella marine grade and upholstery grade fabrics.
We're getting ready to sew the Sombrella Horizon vinyl fabric and make channeling. The maroon panel, the maroon fabric, we're going to have sewn channels in it. But you don't want to cut your pattern before you put the channeling in place. So what you want to do is you want to cut this oversized, sew your channeling in, and then pattern it. Since we have 2 halves, we still have to find the center point. So I'm going to put a little cross hair here and down here. So now we know the center. Now, channeling can shrink up a few inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this to the approximate size of the shape, but obviously oversized. So I don't need any seam allowance, but I want to go big. So I'm just randomly striking a line about 2 inches around the perimeter on all sides. Now here we wanted to add the 1 inch, okay? So what I'm going to do there is I'm just going to come down here again another 2 inches or so. It doesn't usually shrink because my channeling is going to go this way. It doesn't usually shrink from here to there. It shrinks from here to here. So basically across the channeling it'll shrink up a little bit. Here it'll be probably about the same size. Now I'll flip this panel, put it on my crosshairs, and do the same thing.
After marking the lines on the underside of our Sombrella Horizon fabric, we'll cut it out.
This is sew foam. If you get a close-up look at it, you'll see that this backing is very light fabric, and the idea is that when you sew channeling through the fabric, the stitch will not easily pull through the polyurethane foam. So we have our vinyl, wrong side facing up, and we're going to use a foam lock spray adhesive and spray both the vinyl and the foam.
When applying the glue to the sew foam, spray the side without the fabric backing.
So I've got my panel folded in half, and I'm going to place it on this approximately the center. There is no center really, but I just want to get it on the area that I sprayed the glue on. And smooth it out. Sometimes you can get some glue buildup on your scissors, and you can use a dry lubricant. We're going to use McLube Sail Coat and coat the scissors. This can help the glue buildup from building up on your scissors. Now we'll cut the sew foam around the perimeter of that oversized vinyl piece. So now we have the Sombrella Horizon fabric glued to the sew foam. So we put the pattern material on here so that I have extra here in case it shrinks this direction. What I'm going to do is I'm going to strike right on this 1 inch line or this line that indicates where we're going to basically be stapling. Now no one's going to see those staples because we actually have a cushion that comes in and it'll take up probably that much of the channeling material. So this will give us the opportunity to do some reversing when we're sewing the channeling, because we're going to be pulling hard on the bottom edge of this channeling material. We don't want these stitches to come loose. So again, I'm going to do a crosshair, even though we're not patterning for this, so we're just trying to find the bottom line. I can flip this to this side. I still have plenty, and we'll do the same thing here. So when we're sewing the channeling, when I get my lines in here, when I get to the sewing machine and I get to this line, I'm going to do reversing. Okay, this is the back side of our channeled piece, and we already have the center location. We're going to strike lines so that we can use these as a reference of where we want to sew the channeling. So our first line is going to determine the straightness of all the other lines. We're using a clear acrylic ruler, and we're going to put the channeling 2 inches apart. We can just position it exactly 2 inches, and you can see through it, so you can put that line directly on top of the 2-inch location and strike your second line. So you just keep doing this on both the left side and the right side until we have lines every 2 inches apart. Okay, we're marking on the underside of the cream Sunbrella Horizon fabric. My middle line is basically perpendicular with the bottom edge. Doesn't have to be exactly right, but that way when we flip it, it'll be basically an exact duplicate and I'll have plenty of fabric. So we need a 1/2 inch seam allowance as indicated here, from here to here. So I'm going to mark up, and I'm going to randomly make a guess of what a 1/2 inch seam allowance is. I'm pretty accurate at this. Okay, so this is the edge here that we're going to fold on. I'm going to mark where the pattern's resting here, even though that there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance that comes up here. This is the pattern, so I know where to mark it over here. Same thing over here at this corner, though this is not an edge that needs to be patterned because it's just basically fabric pole material. I'm going to mark it or frame that corner. Then I'm going to trace here right on the edge. If we look at this corner, there's 2 inches marked here, which means I want to go 2 inches beyond this corner approximately, just for excess fabric to staple it in place. And if we look at this, this is 3 inches basically from this dotted line, so I'm just going to trace randomly approximately 3 inches down from there, like that. Now we'll flip this panel to do the opposite half and line it up to our frame. The frame corners. We'll do the same thing here. We will add a 1/2 inch seam allowance from this point. So there's where the 1/2 inch seam allowance will come out here, and we add the 1/2 inch here, just like we did on the other side. With this one, we need to mirror it as well. We need to add a 1/2 inch here along this bottom edge, and then these edges are just right along the edge, but a 1/2 inch only on this bottom edge. This one, and we frame the pattern even though there's a 1/2 inch there. Then we flip it and do the same on this side. We're going to cut out both of these patterns on the lines that we struck.
These 2 patterns are for the back of the chair. We're using Sunbrella Horizon Capriccio Vellum, which is a premium engineered synthetic leather vinyl available from Sailrite.
Okay, we added a 1/2 inch seam allowance on these 2 sides and this end, and we added 3 inches to the leg. This one will be sewn to the opposite half. This is too hard to flip. It is going to have a mirrored image of the other one, but it will be sewn here. So instead of using the pattern to mirror the opposite half, I'm going to use the one that I cut out that already includes all the seam allowance. So its outside surface is facing up, while the underside surface of the one underneath is facing down.
If you hold the fabric in place well and don't move it, you can actually just trim around that fabric to cut out your new piece.
Okay, we have everything patterned except for this is oversized because we haven't sewn the channeling in it yet. So what is the first step? Well, the first step is to sew these 2. This is the back of our chair together. And they go like this. This edge gets sewn to this edge, and this is the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you can almost tell exactly where they go. You can always refer to your patterns, which have the up arrows too. So my pattern would say this is up and this is up. So this edge is sewn. Then for the banding here, these 2 get sewn together. So they'll get flipped like this. So outside surfaces are facing each other, and then they'll get sewn together here. Same thing with this one. Let's go back to this one. Outside surfaces face each other. We'll start at the center and we'll sew out, and we'll start at the center again and sew out. So this is our first 2 steps.
In this chapter, we'll show you how to sew the vinyl together. To sew this Helm seat, we're going to use the Sayrite Ultrafeed LSZ1 sewing machine set up in the collapsible sewing table.
We'll take the upper band of the armrest and place them so outside surfaces are facing each other, and we will sew a 1/2 inch from this edge. Most of these stitches are going to be a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to use the magnetic guide, but I'm not going to position it like this. I'm actually going to position it like this so that I can make turns a little bit easier, and I know where the 1/2 inch position is right across from the needle. So it's going to be like this, and then I can grab the fabric and do all kinds of things. For this I won't need to, but for other ones I will.
The stitch length is set up to about 5 millimeters to sew this banding together. This is a straight stitch. We're using V92 polyester thread.
Now I'm going to put a top stitch in this. Now you don't have to put a top stitch in it. You can use your teeth to cut this thread since we don't have any nippers anymore. Somebody took them. But it's better to have nippers if you got them. So I've splayed the fabric out to do a semi-flat felled seam, and the tail's on this side. So the flange, and I'm just going to put a top stitch right here. Splaying the fabric as I sew. Not doing any reversing. Other panels will come up against that edge. Here's the center. This is the edge that gets sewn onto here. So we're going to fold it at the center and create a notch just so that we can easily find the center position. Do the same thing to this one. So to sew these 2 panels, I'll basically take them and flip them like this so outside surfaces are facing each other. And we'll start at the center and sew this direction, then we'll sew this direction.
The reason we start at the center location is because these panels have shape. Starting at the center means that we know exactly where the panels should be lined up.
So I want to match up side edges as I sew. This stuff sews beautifully. So does the Sayrite Ultrafeed sewing machine. Umbrella Horizon fabric is really great stuff. A 4-way stretch vinyl, easy to work with, nice and thick and soft. I think you'll love it. Expect a little dog ear. That is completely normal.
I found my nippers.
Here's why you expect the dog ear. Look at that. It comes out perfect. Now we need to sew the other half, and to do that we need to flip the panel because you can't sew in the opposite direction without flipping the panel. Now when I sew, I'm going to sew starting about 1 inch or so on top of the previous stitches, and I want to make sure that my stitch is right on top of them, otherwise it will be visible at the middle position. So I'm going to lower my needle by hand, making sure that it's right on top of those previous stitches. Then I'll lower my presser foot and continue to sew. Let's cut these trailers to get them out of the way. That one I'm okay with. To enable us to do a top stitch, we're going to put the tail on the top panel. This is the top panel, this is the lower panel. Reason being is if water comes across here, it comes off kind of like a shingle. If you put the tail on the bottom one like this, then water would come across here and run into that channel. So I'm going to put the top stitch on the top panel. I have to move the magnetic guide to do a top stitch. Now here we can start at the ends. We don't have to worry about starting in the middle. And I'm going to do it so that the small panel is going through the throat of the sewing machine. So make sure the tail on the bottom side is going the direction that you want. For us, it's the top panel, so it's going that way towards the right. for us since we're putting our stitch on the top panel. And I splay my fabric apart as I sew. Now remember, everybody's going to see this stitch, so make sure that you take your time on it and concentrate on keeping it nice and straight.
Now we'll concentrate on the inside back, and we'll sew channeling into the vinyl.
I like to sew the channeling at 6 millimeters, so this is all the way up. We're in straight stitch, the needle's in center position, and I want to sew this first stitch and check my stitch tension to make sure I like it. You could do this on some scrap, but this stitch is probably not going to be visible anyway because it's probably going to be cut off. So I'm okay doing it in this because this is probably going to be scrap. Other thing, when you sew channeling, this is a 1/2 inch sew foam with the vinyl on the underside. You have to make sure your presser foot is down, because if you sew with the presser foot up, even though it looks like the presser foot's down, it's not. You can have sewing machine problems. You can jam up your machine. So with every pass, you got to lower your presser foot. Okay, I'm going to hold on to my trailers and sew.
The angle of the camera makes it look like the stitch is not directly on top of that line we struck, but it is.
Now, when I get to this point here, I'm going to do some reversing. No one's going to see this, and this will lock that stitch in place here. Okay, stitch tension looks really good here, so I'm satisfied with it. On the top, so you can't hardly see this because there's so much sew foam, but I can see the knot here, so I'm definitely going to have the knot on this side, which is what I want. I don't want the knot to be visible at all on the vinyl side, the side that's supposed to be pretty. So now we'll just continue sewing each one of these. Lower your foot, hold your trailers if you can. When you get to that line, do some reversing.
We'll just keep sewing down every one of those lines directly on top of the line. We skipped ahead here.
Okay, I'm at my halfway point. You can tell there by the crosshair. And notice how you could just scroll this material up to get it underneath the arm of the sewing machine. So we'll just sew this one. And then what I can do, if the material gets a little bit too bulky, is just start sewing from the opposite end. Now I showed some pretty aggressive reversing. You really only need to reverse it one pass at that line, so watch. That's completely enough. I got a little bit carried away at first. So now that we're at the middle position, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the assembly and start sewing from this end, and then we can scroll it the opposite direction so it's a smaller assembly. And then when I get to the reverse line here, I will do the same thing again. Reverse a little bit and sew all the way to the top.
Because of the angle of the camera, it looks like I'm not sewing directly on top of that line, but I am.
Okay, we started with a full bobbin, and we're doing a lot of sewing. I would prefer not to run out of bobbin in the middle of sewing channeling. I don't know how much bobbin I have left, but I'm going to change it out now because I don't want to run out when I'm in the middle of a stitch.
Let's move on.
So we positioned our stitch right on the center position here. So this is the stitch that's the center of the plate here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a notch. Now this notch is going to disappear basically because we haven't patterned this yet, but at least I know exactly where this center is based on that notch. So now I take my pattern material and I place it directly on that notch there. And remember my reversing stitches? They're down here. Well, they should fall pretty much on the edge of the pattern material. And remember what I talked about shrinkage? It did shrink up because we had probably this much fabric here. And now it's a lot less fabric. So before we do anything, let's make sure that we have enough material on the other side as well at that approximate position. And we do. You can see we have plenty. So we're good here. So this is the side that We're going to put it on first. We're going to make sure our reverse stitching is very close to the bottom edge, and it is. And then I'm going to put a sandbag on top of this so it doesn't move. A weighted sandbag. And then I'm going to pattern directly on top of this edge. We are not adding any seam allowance for this part, and I'm using the Scriball pencil white, which works really well for vinyl. Watch this. I use my finger, I just wetted it with my saliva, and it comes right off. Marks come off it easily with this, but you always should check whatever vinyl you're using to make sure that your marks come off. Okay, now at this bottom edge, if you look here, it says 1 inch. So we need to add 1 inch of material to that bottom. The amount of 1 inch, I'm going to guess at it, is about this much for me. So I'm just approximating 1 extra inch of vinyl at the bottom side. Now we'll take this and we'll flip it to this side. And we'll put it directly on top of this mark, because this is our top edge, and make sure that this stitch is right in the middle. And we'll do the same thing to this side, the exact same thing. One thing I didn't do on the other side, which I need to do, is put the stop position of where we're going to stop sewing the banding in place. So I'm going to mark inside pretty heavily, and I'll just put an S here to indicate that that's a stop. We're going to stop sewing the banding there, and the rest of the banding will hang loose. We need to do that on the other side as well. Okay, now we'll just cut it out. This is the edge that isn't so crucial. That's why I'm a little bit outside the 1 inch area, because I like to be safe rather than sorry. This edge over here is very crucial. So I'm going to cut right on that line that we struck.
This top edge has no reversing done to it. The reason being is the panel was oversized anyways. So we're cutting right through those stitches that creates the channeling. The reason being is that this top edge will have another adjacent panel sewn to it, and the adjacent panel's stitch will cross over those stitches, locking them in place.
So here's our center at the bottom. I'm going to cut a triangle into that. This will be helpful later on when we're stapling it to the base of the chair. We're also going to cut a notch up here at the top, at the center. This will be used to help us know where to start sewing the adjacent panel to it. And then here on the stops, where we're going to stop sewing, I'm going to cut a little triangle there as well, because I'm going to have a hard time seeing this because I'm going to be sewing from the other side. In fact, you may want to cut it out of your foam as well there. I'll do the same thing to the other side at the stop.
Next up, we're going to join the back panel to the top banding, or the armrest banding.
It is extremely crucial that this band gets sewn onto the plates correctly. So to do this, I put the chair back up here, and we're going to imitate the band going on the chair. It can only go one way, like this. Okay, because you can see the shapes built into it that way. If you tried to get it reversed like this, can't be done because the shape's going the opposite direction. So this is easy. Band goes up here. And then this is the inside back with our channeling, and it goes in like that. And then that's the back side, and that's a cream color. So the best way to keep from getting confused is to take this and mark on the underside the color. For us, it's burgundy. So I'm going to mark a B with my pencil on the back side of the vinyl. That's the burgundy side. And then on this side, I'm going to mark a C with my pencil. And now I will not get confused. I know that the burgundy is sewn here and the cream is sewn here. This is our back panel where we just sewed those two pieces together. And there's a dog ear here. I told you that's normal. We're just going to cut that off so we don't have to worry about it when we go to sew on the band to it. So I'm going to take the band off of this, and I'm going to lay it onto this There you can see my C for cream and my B for burgundy, and it is going to be sewing like this to this panel. Sewing, starting at the center here and starting in the center there and sewing out. We're going to put a top stitch in this too. The reason that we're going to sew this back panel to the band at the top here first, before we sew the channeling to the band, is that we're going to put a top stitch in this. Now that's a preference and not necessarily a rule. We just think it looks better. So why not do it with something that doesn't have as much bulk now? Because the channeling is very bulky. Okay, we're going to put the Deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide on the 1/2 inch mark on the needle plate. That way I can use it as a reference for matching up these two fabrics. I'm going to use this stitch here as my center. There's my notch for the center of this panel that we already talked about. We got the C going to cream fabric. We want to make sure that happens. And we'll match up the edges, and we'll start at the center position and sew around the perimeter, matching up the edges as we sew, sewing a 1/2 inch inside the edge. Buried my needle there to make this little turn.
This umbrella Horizon fabric is a 4-way stretch vinyl, so you want to be sure not to pull or stretch the fabric as it is being sewn. Sure, you have to manipulate the fabric to get the edges to line up, but once you start sewing, you should stop pulling and just hold the fabric in place as you sew.
Now we got a little bit of a curve here, and watch what we do. We can actually pivot this around to make that turn. So my hand's under here, so I'm gonna roll this fabric around to make this turn. That's all there is to it. Okay, now we can't start from the center and sew the same direction. We actually have to flip the fabric, because I can't sew in this direction that way. So I'm going to flip the whole assembly, this, and start from that center position yet again. Now when I first start sewing, I'm going to sew an inch or two over the previous stitches, but I have to be careful to enter my needle right on top of the other stitches. So I haven't lowered my presser foot yet. I buried my needle right on top of that stitch. That way I won't see any threads when I sew at the middle position. And then we just simply sew around this the same way that we did on the other side. We put a top stitch here in the back, and it really looks great. You don't have to put a top stitch in this band, but we're going to. Now, you can do it a variety of ways. You can put the top stitch in the band here, and the band will be the highest point, so water would shed off like this. So that's probably where I'm going to put it. But if you think it looks better having the top stitch down here, then you can do that. It's your choice. I'm going to put it in the band so that when it's like when this is an armchair, water actually sheds down like a shingle. Okay, so I've got it splayed here in my tail. My seam allowance, I always call it a tail, is to the right. So I'm going to put my top stitch here, and I'm going to use this part of the presser foot as a guide. So right about there. My stitch length is set up at around 4 millimeters, which I think looks good. That's what we did with the other top stitch, so I want to keep it consistent. Splay the panel, pull them as you sew. Pull them left and right. And then just make sure that your fabric is, your tail is on the correct side, for us the right side, as you sew. If you need to make adjustments, bury your needle, and then you can feel for things and adjust everything without having to lose your spot. Okay, we're going around a curve here for the top stitch. So there's going to be some bubbles in this fabric here, but your main goal is just to splay the fabric out and sew a little bit at a time around that curve. So watch what I do. Bury the needle, splay the fabric out, even though there are bubbles all over the place, because as we're going around a curve, just do make sure that the inch or so that you're sewing through is smooth. That's all there is to it. I can feel the tail on the underside, so I don't have to wonder about where that tail is.
Next, we'll join the inside back to the top banding, or arm banding.
Here's the back panel and the banding already sewn on. So it's going to go so the outside surfaces face each other, and the banding part is the center where we're going to start sewing. We'll sew from the middle out and then from the middle out again. Our stitch length for this, I'm going to make fairly small. I'm not doing a top stitch, so I'm going to make it about 4 to 5 millimeters. Now, I've got the fabric underneath the presser foot. The foot's not down. Remember, we have to remember that we're sewing this 1/2 inch sew foam, so you got to be sure to put your foot down or you're going to cause sewing machine problems. So here's my center position, matching up this seam here where my fingernail is to the middle of that here. Okay, now the reason there's a notch is because I didn't have enough material there, but who cares? I'm going to be sewing in the knot or inside the notch. All right, we just get started sewing. The Serrite Ultrafeed LS-Z1 sewing machine works phenomenal for upholstery applications like this. So does the LS1. It's a straight stitch only. This is a straight stitch and zigzag sewing machine. Walking foot just feeds this stuff beautifully. Now as I start to go around this curve, I'm going to grab this bottom panel and start flipping it to the magnetic guide. Pretty easy.
We did not bar tack or reverse our channeling stitches, since the bar tacks would show, and this stitch will lock them so they will not come loose.
Nice. Inside curve, I'm going to pull the panel around the opposite direction. I don't want to pull too much on this 4-way stretch fabric because then I'll stretch it out of shape. I only want to pull when I'm adjusting and then release so that the sewing machine does the work. Okay, see our stop position here? We're getting close to it. We're going to stop sewing at that position. So I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for it. And I'm going to do a little bit of reversing here. May have to cut those stitches up if it needs adjusting, but hopefully not. Now, same thing again. We have to flip the whole assembly in order to sew from the other direction from the middle position. So I'm going to put my fabric underneath, and then I'm going to bury my needle on I'm at least an inch or two into the previous stitches at the first part. I'm going to bury my needle right on top of those stitches. Then I'm going to lower my presser foot. so I know I'm right on where I need to be. Then I'm going to make sure this fabric on the bottom side's laying nice and neat, and sew in the opposite direction. Same procedure. Here's our ending spot where we're going to stop sewing, and we also have a curve here, so watch what we do for the curve. Just one more thing to watch, hopefully you've learned something. I'm going to pull this panel over as I'm getting to it. There's my stop point. A little bit of reversing.
Now we'll staple the cover onto the Helm chair frame.
We know where the center line is on the foam, and pretty soon I'm going to pull vinyl over top of it and I won't be able to see the center line again. So I'm just going to put a center line on the plastic on this side. That'll help us to position the vinyl. And then on the bottom side, there's a center line on the back, and I'm going to put that center line here as well. Actually, we don't need to because we have this as a center, so we're good.
Silk film is then laid over the foam. This silk film, as discussed earlier, does two things. For one, it makes the vinyl pull over the sticky foam, which does have some spray glue on it, easily, and it also helps to keep any water that may leak through the seams or the stitching to penetrate into the foam.
We've turned the cover right side out, and we're ready to install. Our first staples are going to go in the middle section on the underside of the chair. So our task is to line this seam up with the edge of the foam. If we have this to the edge of the foam, these staples on the bottom side should be in the right spot. We also have the center position here, so we just need to center that at the bottom. So I'm going to tip this back. So I'm going to pull from down here, and I'm going to look at that seam. That seam's really in a pretty good spot right now. I think I'm pretty happy with it. So you can see this is centered. This is our center of our chair. I'm going to just put in a few tacking staples very far from the edge, and I'm holding my stapler a little bit crooked so that the staples can be easily pulled out if they're in the wrong spot. I don't want to just put one staple in on each side because it can possibly rip out. So now I'll flip it over and we'll start working from this side. And we're going to find the center. Center's there. And remember, we marked on the seat where the center is here. So hopefully we know exactly where that's supposed to go. So I'm going to pull the vinyl taut there and put a few staples very close to this white line. Okay, so I have the vinyl pushed up against the foam, and we have the vinyl on our center line, and the edge up here looks great. And so I'm going to put some staples right at that edge, and I'm going to put these in permanently. So 1, 2, 3, that should hold it. All right, so I'm going to keep coming around. I've got a second helper here, and we can just keep going around making sure that we're happy with our lines, that they're nice and straight, our sew lines, channeling lines. And right now I'm only putting staples in.
We want to get back in here.
Yep, totally. We're just putting staples to hold it in place.
Oh, wait, are we happy with that? Yeah.
He's going to pull down here. He's going to create a good spot for me to staple. I'm going to put some staples at that locale. Right here.
Yep.
Okay, so watch what Matt's doing. He's taking both his hands, pushing down from the top to get all the slack out. Then he holds his hands there while I staple in the middle. I'm using a long nose staple gun. It's almost paramount to use a long nose staple gun for this type of application. A short nose won't be long enough. Okay, so right here we're going to fold this back because this isn't going to even be visible, and then Matt's going to tension that, and I'm going to staple this down.
Remember, we will have a cushion that inserts into this opening, and that cushion will cover at least 3 inches of this vinyl, so you won't see any of this at the bottom edge.
Okay, and then let's get, are we good on this edge? Yeah.
Yeah, that edge looks great.
Yeah, let's get right up at the front. Okay.
We're just going to cut away some of the silk film. It doesn't need to be at the base of the chair. And it'll make it easier for us to work on the sides, which we're going to do next. Now, we have this in the preliminary position right now, the back of the chair, but we have not put in enough staples to hold it in permanently. So we'll do that later on. Right now we're going to put the vinyl piece on the front here so that we can actually finish up the front. I'm not going to pattern that because it's basically just a rectangle. I'm going to cut it slightly bigger than theirs out of some of the scrap. This is the cream color. Then we'll use this. Okay, here's our piece. We're going to tuck it underneath this foam and under this ridge here. And get it on basically semi-straight. Doesn't have to be perfect because all it is covering that plastic piece. Now put a few staples here. Come across to this side. Stuff it under there. Like that. Staple the bottom ridge. I will be putting more staples in after this is done. So this foam should be stapled back. See how much foam sticking out past this edge because it's not being compressed? So I'm going to push the foam back like so and insert a staple holding that foam back. Couple staples. Okay, so that basically allows us to fold this and staple it hiding that foam like that. So we'll do the same thing over here. I'm going to cut right across the front of this like that and then remove this little wedge like that, get rid of it. Then this can be rolled back with this as it covers the foam.
After completing this, we decided there was another way to do it. That's what we're going to discuss now.
Looking at this corner where the vinyl takes a hem here, we could have done this differently. We probably should have. There was a lot of foam here, and we stapled that foam back to try to keep it from sneaking out from this edge. But in reality, we probably should have shaved the foam, started up here and shaved it down, and then ended the foam directly at this bottom edge. That would have allowed the vinyl to come closer to this frame structure and pull in this hem. We didn't do that. We could undo the vinyl and redo that, but it's basically going to be hidden by the board that has the bolster here, so it's probably not a big deal. One of the things you can do, if you'd like, is use a Dura snap, and you can actually fashion a snap that uses the same vinyl that you're using for the upholstery job and screw it in here, which will draw this down tight. It's an option for a situation like this, or you can undo the vinyl at this corner and cut some of the foam away, or you can live with it like it is. It's not too bad, and it's probably not going to be visible, but we're going to put a Dura snap in there just to show you that process.
We'll be showing that later on.
So there's a little wrinkle here. We haven't stapled the sides, but we want to try to massage this banding down and then hopefully apply a little bit of pressure here as we're doing this, which will hopefully take out that slight wrinkle.
A little later on, we'll show you how to use steam to remove wrinkles.
Now what I might do is actually tilt the chair back here before I even create this fold, and with some of this excess fabric that I have at the bottom, actually staple it under this pressure that I have with a temporary staple. That's better. So I'm going to massage it again, bring it up, and put a temporary staple right there, crooked, so I could easily get it out. Now I can concentrate on making this look better. So I'm going to hem this in to create a nice fold, hiding the silk film and the vinyl and the foam. Okay, I can tuck that silk film in. Now I can't staple here, but I can staple to the bottom side. So again, I'm going to lift it like this so that you can see what I'm doing here. Tuck everything in place. It's rolled, and put a staple right here. I'm just going to put one in right now and make sure I'm happy. So I'm just using a screwdriver to tuck that silk film in there. So we definitely want to come back and put more staples around the perimeter now that we have it in position. Okay, I'm massaging the fabric and pulling it taut to the bottom side. Okay, I'm going to pull taut, and I'm going to start at the corners now that we have the back fastened, and try to, the corner is going to have a few little wrinkles in it. It's not uncommon because it has to take some shape there. So you just want to try to distribute those wrinkles so that things look good. So what I've decided instead is to pull the fabric towards the front, which will help me get rid of some of these wrinkles so that I can distribute them better. Still got a wrinkle there. We can pull that out here. This is a 4-way stretch vinyl. If we do that, it comes out. If I do this, does it come out? Yeah, there it came out just like that. So I'm going to put a staple here. Nice. I'll be tensioning it a little bit better here if I can get a hold of the vinyl. Now we got a big wrinkle here. I'm going to try to distribute that a little bit. Make it into small wrinkles. There we go. There, now how's it look from the side is the key, not the bottom.
This is actually quite acceptable, but if you wanted to use steam heat on it, it would remove some of those wrinkles. We'll show that later on.
Just going for a corner that looks good, that's all you're trying to do. This again is the bottom side. Now we just cut away any excess so that it doesn't stick out the bottom.
You may not require the use of the Dura snap, but it's a good idea to know how it's made in case you do.
This is the W1 hand press, and it's bolted to this table. Without being bolted, it wouldn't work at all. And this is some of our vinyl that we want to make the Dura snap from. The die set comes with a hole cutter. So just insert the hole cutter and then give it a blow. And there's our vinyl pieces. This is the number 30 die set, heavy, because it's a heavy vinyl. We'll put the vinyl so the outside surface is facing up. We'll put the cap in it, and then we'll use the pusher to push the cap down into the die, like that. That means this bottom, you have to have this off the table so this bottom can actually come out to do that. The plastic washer has a side that's a little bit wider at the top, and the bottom's a little bit skinnier. The wider goes up. This goes into the base of the W1 hand press. This Goes right over the top of it. And then we depress the lever. I usually give it a little 2 blows. Take this off, and you have your Dura snap with the vinyl cover. Okay, we're using a screw stud with a 5/8 inch threaded screw.
This step is not required. In fact, you may want to skip this altogether, but we are showing it just in case you have an issue like this.
Now we can snap our Dura snap over the top of that snap. And they do not come off easily. I mean, I'm putting a lot of pressure on it. It does not come off. There we go.
The seat is a completely separate unit. We're going to show you how to pattern it next.
Now, because we added a sew foam, and our foam is 1 inch in the inside, which is what theirs was, but it was compressed, this board does not fit very well in here. No big deal. What we're going to do is we're going to take this over to the bandsaw, and we're going to trim probably about a 1/4 inch or so and see how it fits then. That also means that we're going to have to modify the foam as well. So here's our bolster, and here's the back of our piece. I'm going to recut the foam after I've trimmed the board so that the foam comes over the edge only a 1/4 inch. So right now it's over the edge by almost 1 inch. I'm going to have it come over a 1/4 inch. We're not going to show that because we already basically showed you how to cut the foam. We're just going to resize it to our new cut size of board. And now I've cut the edges off of the backer board so that it fits in here better. Okay, I've cut the foam to match the backer board with excess around the perimeter. If I center the backer board in here, I have more than a 1/4 inch. I really have about a 1/2 inch extra around the perimeter. And it doesn't have to be exact because the vinyl will push the foam into the backer board and it'll look great that way. This is the old vinyl and we're going to duplicate it, except for we're not going to put a top stitch here. This is just going to be straight fabric without the top stitch. So we have to think about the correct order. What we want to do is we want to fashion this plate and then the side boxing and then this plate and then this boxing. But the order of sewing is important. First, we're going to take this side boxing and sew this piping onto it. After that's done, we're going to join it to this plate. Then we will take this plate and we'll sew on the boxing. Then we'll sew on this piping. So these are 2 separate plates at that point. We'll also sew on the fabric pole. After that's done, we'll sew this assembly back here to this assembly. That way we have the piping going inside of this assembly. So first let's consider the knee rise or the bolster. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a measurement from the joint here, and I'm not going to add any seam allowance. I'm just going to go straight to the joint and I'm going to measure down because I'm going to have extra fabric down here to staple to the backer board. I'm going to add about 3 to 4 inches extra, so 14 inches, which will wrap around and staple to the backer board and give me plenty of fabric for this pole down here too. For the width of this knee rise or bolster, we're going to just measure from side to side, and we get about 18 inches, a little bit, an 1/8 inch more than that, but I'm going to go 18 inches. If you measure here, this is 18 inches, and I want these to be equal. We'll be using a 4-way stretch vinyl. Sailrite has several brands. This brand is Umbrella Horizon. Usually in a 4-way stretch, what we do for large cushions that have a lot of width is we'll take away 1 inch and we'll also take away the seam allowance because the fabric will stretch and it'll compress the foam nicely. But this one, if we measure from edge to edge, is only 18 inches. And when after the seam allowance of a 1/2 inch is taken up, it'll end up being 17 inches. And 17 inches will compress this foam nicely, and the vinyl will actually stretch slightly. But in this scenario, since it's such a small width, we do not want to take away the 1 inch that we typically do for larger width cushions. For the seat area, the boxing, we need a measurement for that. The height of the boxing needs to be enough to wrap around to the back side, and it looks like 5 inches should do it, but I'm going to go 6 just to be safe. Boxing, we need a measurement for that, and I'm going to cut it extra long. The best way to do that is to use one of these soft tape measures and measure around. and we get about 36 inches. So I'm going to make this 39 inches just so I have extra, and I'll cut it when I'm done. So the boxing will be 39 inches. For the top plate, we're going to pattern that. We'll be using foam lock spray, and I'm just going to spray a little bit on this end. Whoa, jeez. After the glue becomes tacky, we can use the Dura scrim and we can put it on top of this end. We're going to pattern for this knee rise only. We don't need to pattern for the boxing because it just wraps around. What we want to do here is we're going to have trace the edge of the foam. We're going to add some extra down here so we can wrap around to the backer board. Up here, I could trace the edge of the foam, but then I'd have to round this corner. So I'm just going to round it now because we want all the corners at the top to be nicely rounded. That'll always make the cushion look better. So that's a pretty good rounded corner. And we want to do the same thing here. I'm going to round it very close to that foam, hugging that edge a little bit. And then here at the top, we're right along the edge. And then I come down straight like this. Since there's going to be piping in this, I'm going to label it with an arrow and just put a P here. So the piping will basically come up this edge, come to here, and we need it to stop at this juncture where it's going to be sewn onto here. Because if I remember right, yeah, the piping disappears into this, and this will be sewn on about a 1/2 inch underneath this edge. So I'm going to mark a line at a 1/2 inch approximately, and the piping will come to that and stop. So I'm going to label this stop for my piping. So piping sewn on here all the way to here, and it will stop here. Though I will leave the piping a little bit long, my sewing will stop at that 1/2 inch junction. This is the back side of our vinyl here, and I'm going to trace around my pattern here, right along the edges. Then I'm also going to mark this stop position here. And I will also mark with the piping. We need to sew it onto this side with an arrow with a P. So the piping will start here, come up, and we will stop sewing here. The piping tail will probably be down here. We'll cut this out. Now we need a mirrored image of this for the other side, so we're just going to flip it so that outside surfaces are facing each other. And we will cut this one out and put that piping and the stop point on this panel, just the same as we did here. We're going to take this is the outside surface, and we're going to place it on top of our vinyl fabric. And we will trace around it very close to that edge. It doesn't have to be exactly on that edge. I'm about an 1/8 inch outside of it on all sides, including this side. We're not adding any extra seam allowance. We're using a 4-way stretch. So we just cut it out. I wrote down the measurements for the knee rise plate, 14 by 18, and the boxing, 39 by 6. I'm going to do the boxing, then I'm going to cut out the plate to those dimensions.
We will not show cutting out that vinyl to that size. Let's move on to the fabric pole.
We're using a dimensionally stable fabric for our fabric pole, and my least high foam in the back of the seat is 3 inches. My knee riser is 4, and I need to add 1 inch to the lowest foam I have. My lowest foam is 3 inches, so I'm cutting this to 4 inches in height and at least 18 inches, which is the width of that foam. It's a little bit longer than 18 inches.
Our seat requires some piping. We're going to show you how to make that now.
Okay, piping comes across here, so we need about 20 inches, and we have piping that wraps around here, and that is about, move this out of the way, 15 inches. 15 times 2 is 30, so 50 inches. So our piping for most vinyl applications, we cut a strip that is 1.5 inches wide. So I'm using the clear acrylic ruler to do that. I already have one line struck on here that's straight. You can see here I'm making a cross-cut piping. I'm not making a bias cut piping. Reason being, we're using a 4-way stretch, and also I don't do that even if I'm not using a 4-way stretch with vinyl seating fabrics. Because if you need to go around a curve, you can just cut slits in the flange of the piping, which you will see later on when we're sewing. I'm installing the larger cording tunnel for the Ultrafeed LSZ. It performs much better when sewing piping because of the large tunnel. Now you can't just leave this on when you're doing zigzag stitching because the zigzag needs the center toe to be closed. But when doing straight stitches and piping, this is definitely a big bonus for the Ultrafeed LSZ. Now the LS1 doesn't necessarily need it. It has a larger tunnel, so you don't have to worry about it. But for this, it makes a big difference. What we're going to be using is a 5/32 inch foam piping. It's fairly firm, but doesn't soak up any water. Makes for great piping applications for marine seating or outdoor seating vinyl applications. So we'll put it under the tunnel, and I'll just sew a straight stitch right along the piping. Okay, we have the larger cording tunnel put into the Ultrafeed LSC. I believe it does a better job of sewing piping, especially with the Sunbrella Horizon, which is a rather thick vinyl. You can see that I'm not feeding it in perfectly straight. It's actually canted slightly this direction towards this edge, which puts that stitch a little bit closer to the piping.
Let's sew the boxing to the seat first.
So this is the bolster. We'll have piping sewing onto these. This is the fabric pole. This is the seat portion, and this is the boxing for the seat portion. We're going to start by sewing this and this together. So I'm going to put it over here to the approximate middle position, and I'll just start on a side and sew around here. I'm going to put the Deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide on the 1/2 inch mark of the needle plate, and I'm going to put it on sideways like this so that I can go around corners nicely. I still have my cording foot put on, but as long as you're sewing straight stitch, it works great. I'll roll this bottom assembly over as I go around the corner, matching up the edges. Because the boxing goes around the corner like this, you can see that it's curled up. You can actually relax that by just cutting some slits in the flange or the seam allowance area, going not too close to your stitches. And what that does is it allows it to relax. We'll do that on both corners. Here's where my vinyl rests underneath here. So I'm going to take the clear acrylic ruler again and position it so that it is right along the edge of the boxing, perpendicular, and then I'm going to strike a line at that point. Okay, so see how it's a little bit off over here? This makes this edge go straight down. Then we'll trim it to size. We're going to do the same thing to this side here. On the fabric pole, I like to strike a line that's clearly visible, a 1/2 inch from the edge on both sides, and we'll use this to staple it in place so we have a reference of where we should staple. I'm going to sew this fabric pole onto the seat cushion portion at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, mainly so that this seam doesn't show up. And I don't need to sew it into the boxing, so I'm just going to put it right to the edge of our seam and sew it so that this presser foot is right up against the edge. That'll put my stitch about at a 1/4 inch position. This is just to secure it in place. Do some reversing. Come into the seam, and I'll do some reversing here. Okay, so now I'm just going to sew piping onto the boxing and across that area where we sewed the fabric pole. I'll start it so it's a little bit off the edge. I'm going to fold this tail so that it goes back towards the boxing. I think it'll look better that way. So when I get to this tail, I'm going to make sure that the tail is again folded back towards the boxing so it's the same.
Next, we'll concentrate on the knee rise or the bolster.
Onto the boxing for the knee riser, we have piping that sews up here and stops sewing here. So because it stops sewing here, I'm going to put a mark. I'm going to put a little triangle here to indicate where I'm going to stop sewing. Okay, we have to sew on the opposite side, so I'll flip this over. I can't start from here because I have to sew with the piping like this. So I have to start from here. So I'm going to leave about 1 inch of this going past that stop point, but I'm going to start sewing at that stop point. There's the stop point. Match the flange up, lower my foot, and we will start sewing there. Now I'm going to start going around this curve, and sometimes cutting some relief notches in the flange like we talked about earlier will help the piping to take the curve. Don't cut deeper than your seam allowance. See how that cut makes a beautiful curve? When we get to this one, we'll do the same thing. Now see how the piping's not very even here? Not a big deal. Just try to look for your 1/2 inch seam allowance and keep it lined up with that edge. We'll do the same thing with the other one, starting obviously at this end, since it's a mirrored image of this. You get to this corner, we'll cut some notches. So there's my stop point. I stopped sewing a little bit far of it, no big deal. I'm going to cut it with about 1 inch extra. Okay, so here's our assembly. This is our fabric pole area. This is the side. So what we'll do is we'll start sewing here at the stop, and this will get sewn on like this. Like that. Okay, so start here. This one starts here, gets sewn on like that. So our stop position is right there on the edge, and then we have the cording tunnel still on because we have cording in here. I'm going to put this thread in the center of that foot. There we go, like that. Lower the foot on top of the piping, and we will sew this in. I'll do a little bit of reversing. Okay. I'm pulling this assembly around as I sew. Now here I need to make a sharp turn, so I'm going to lift my presser foot and pull this assembly around a little bit more. I'm a little teeny bit off, so I want to try to straighten that up as soon as I can. There we go. Now we want to turn it right side out and inspect it to make sure that our stitch is close enough to the piping. See, it's not here. So I'm going to put it back in the machine and get a little bit closer to that. Nobody sees these inside stitches, so don't be alarmed at that. So to get closer, I flipped it over to the other side now that everything's in place. And I'll just sew a little bit inside this stitch at the areas that weren't close enough. Especially at this corner here. So we have, this is the edge that has the fabric pull, which means this one has to be started like this. Now I can't sew in that direction, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the assembly and sew with the piping and the boxing on the underside at that start point. Where's the start point? Right there in our plate. So this edge is lined up with it, and we'll do that same procedure for this as we did to the other side, except for this time it's on the underside, the boxing is. Sometimes it's helpful to cut a relief notch even in the plate to get it to go around the corner a little bit. There we go. This is the bolster portion, okay? So this edge is the edge that we need to seam to this edge. Do not get confused and do this edge by accident. This is where it's stapled onto the backer board. So outside surfaces would face each other like this, and we would sew it in place. But I like to actually apply double-sided tape or seam stick for canvas and upholstery right along the flange. And in doing this, this allows us to pre-baste everything in place so I don't have to worry about things moving on me. And I could also be assured that, my panel falls in the right spot. Now notice over here, we accidentally cut this off. We didn't show that on film, but I don't really need it because it's extra fabric anyway. I have more than 3 inches here, so ignore that little chop out. So I'm going to peel off the transfer paper, revealing the double-sided tape. And then what I want is I want these seams here, this seam, to land on top of this seam. And I want this seam to land on top of this seam. And if we've cut everything right, it should. So I'm going to start, not at the end, but at this seam. Now we want this edge of the fabric a 1/2 inch over that. So right there. And then I'm going to be careful not to pull. Remember, it's a 4-way stretch, so you can pull one panel more than the other. Hopefully it's going to be right without having to make modifications. Now, does this seam fall in the same spot? Yes, it does. So if you can see that, right here is our seam on this, and there's our seam here. So the piping is right in line, right where we designed it to be. If the seam did not match up, what you would do is you would center this to the best of your ability so that you had the offset the same on this side and on that side. Now, after we have it lined up, just to hold everything in place, I'm going to put a few staples down its length just to make sure that nothing moves. Now when we get to here, this is going to be under some shape, so I actually like to lift it up and baste it together rather than doing it on the tabletop. That way it can take the shape. So I want this to fold. See how this tail's folding this direction? And this, I shouldn't call it tail, the seam allowance is folding here, and the seam allowance here is folding this direction. That's for the best possible lay of the fabric. Then I'm going to match up these edges all the way down its length. Now, don't be alarmed about there being extra fabric here. We put a lot of excess fabric in there. That goes around and staples to the backer board. So I'm going to put another staple here just to hold it all in place in my seam allowance. And then we'll do the same thing over here. Okay, to make this sew a little bit easier, we're actually going to turn this boxing on the seat portion up. And that kind of lets everything collapse into the middle of the cushion and gives us a nice straight edge for this sewing application. Okay, so there's a lot of bulk here, but the Sayrite Ultra Feed sewing machines can go through this and over this bulk pretty easily. So everything's laying nice and neat. We want to make sure there's no puckering in here. There isn't right now. And we'll just start sewing right here at this bottom edge with the cording foot in place. Do a little bit of reversing at the beginning. And I'm going to feel for my piping. I can feel it under there. So I'm sewing right next to it. Everything is basted in place and everything is stapled in place. Now see this bump? This would be a bad thing if I sewed that bump in. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to lay that so that it's nice and flat like this. So the bump's gone. Very important. Okay, and we want it smooth over here. I can still feel my piping, so I'm going to transition from this piping to this piping, which is the same piping. I'm going to go slow over this bump. I may have to help the sewing machine through it. Oh, looks like it's going to do it all on its own. Everything's laying nice and neat, no bumps. That shouldn't be there, I should say. Now we're into the piping on the side. Okay, we're coming to the next bump. So we want to make sure everything's laying flat and that my fold's at the right spot and that everything looks good on the bottom side. See how I flattened this out here? So when we get to this, this little wrinkle here, I'm going to make sure this wrinkle's out of it. There we go. Now here it's going to probably get caught on that. What you do is you bury your needle and then you can lift your presser foot and then use a screwdriver and lower your presser foot. Oops, probably didn't get close enough. Let's get closer. There we go. Now we can lift our presser foot. We can push this underneath here. This is sometimes a problem, sometimes it's not. If it happens to fall in a specific spot, you may have to push that flange or the tail at that location. So it wants to create a little fold here. So I'm going to have to work that out when I get over this bump. Probably help if I put some of the fabric up here so I'm not fighting its shape. There we go. So what you want to do is you want to look and see if you can see any stitching beside your piping on either side. In ours you cannot. If you did, then you need to re-sew it again because nobody sees the inside. Yeah, it looks like everything's hidden well. Looks like our seam pretty much landed right where we want it. after you're done sewing this and inspecting it, make sure you remove the staples. Don't forget that.
Now we'll staple the cover fabric to the backer board and then assemble the chair.
So I have the foam on here so that the edges are all the same, have the same amount of overlap. About a ½ inch almost, or more than a ¼ inch. I'm going to move one of these foams, the knee riser. And then I'm going to strike a line right on the edge of this foam, right on my backer board. Okay, it's very important to make sure you have the knee rise going to the front here. We have our line. I made a mistake with one line, so I made a second line. So the knee riser's in front. I'm going to open it up to my fabric pull, and I'm going to center the fabric pull. This is a pretty small application, so I don't have to find the center of the fabric pull and the center of the board. I can just line it up from side to side. I'm going to put it right on top of that line that we struck on the board and staple it in place starting at the middle. Then I'll come out to the sides, put it right on top of that line, staple the side. Same thing over here.
The line that we struck on the fabric, the white line, is being placed on top of the line that we struck on the backer board.
Okay. So now I'll staple it securely in place. And at the ends I put a few extra because that's where a lot of stress will be. So this is the top side of our seat. So we're going to flip it so this is the bottom side. And there is a vent hole kind of in the middle back, so right about here. So I'm going to try to not have any sew foam or silk film at that point.
Don't worry if you accidentally cover that hole. We can always rip the silk film out from underneath the backer board when the cushion is complete. We'll show that later on.
So I'm going to tape all this excess here to try to keep it in place. Since we have a vent hole here, I can probably just rip a hole in it to allow some breathability at that locale, like that. This will help us to pull the vinyl onto the foam, and it also creates a water barrier. It's very difficult to pull this over the foam without something like this. I would like there to be no silk film on the bottom side so it can breathe a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this back a little bit to allow some of the foam to be exposed slightly, and I'll put a piece of tape in the middle here. This is the bottom side. I'd never want to put tape on the top side where you could feel it. That'll help hold it in place. So now the knee riser or the bolster foam goes in, and then you pull the vinyl over top. I'm going to pull it as tight as I possibly can on the back side, keeping everything centered. My foam's not quite centered, so I'm going to push it over there. My piping is at the corners, and I'm going to put a preliminary staple in here. So I might be removing this. So I'm going to put this against my belly. I'm going to pull very tight, and I'm going to put 2 staples in the middle with the stapler crooked. That way I can remove these staples if I need to. I'm going to put 4 in there because there's a lot of pressure there. Okay, once this is secured at the front, we'll put the seat in, tuck the silk film underneath. If the silk film's blocking one of those vent holes, we'll cut it out later, just through the hole. And then we put the vinyl over the top. And it will be a tight fit. Okay, then what we want to do is we want to pull on the middle portion of the back until this seam here looks good. Looks like it's just slightly at the edge. We'll pull just so that seam is right along the edge where we like it. You can see that the seam allowance is on the top plate. I'm going to roll that around to the back side. And this can be done after you have some preliminary staples in place, but it's a little bit easier just to feed your hand in here and kind of push that seam allowance down to the boxing rather than the top plate. So that's what I'm doing. I'm pushing the seam allowance around to the side. Okay, so I have the seam allowance going down towards the boxing, which makes the plate look a lot better. And I have the seam right where I want it with the tension that I want. Doesn't take much tension for this because we built it right. And again, I'm going to put a few temporary staples in crooked so they can be easily pulled out, because we're eventually going to staple all around the perimeter here. So now we have it fastened to the front in the middle and to the back in the middle, right where we want it. Then we'll move to the sides and we will do the same thing there. Looking at our seam, pulling it snug till we get that seam right along the edge of the foam so it looks good, looks consistent. And again, I'm going to put a few temporary staples here. Never put just one because it could rip out. 2 to 3. That looks great right there. Now we'll do it over here. There are a few little wrinkles in here. What I'm going to do is, since this side's secured temporarily, I'm going to put my hand on the vinyl and push those wrinkles out to the side as I'm tensioning this side, and that will work those out. And we only have temporary staples in place, so we should be able to get those out a little bit later too, but we want to work them out as best as possible. So now we're going to work on this bolster end. So you can see there's a bump here. We'll pull on this until that bump goes down. And again, if you have to work the vinyl, just move your hand across it and check to make sure you're happy with it. Okay, that looks great like that. Okay, we already fastened the opposite side of the knee riser, and now there's a lot of bulk fabric here, and this bulk fabric makes it hard to make turns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim it off all the way up to where we tacked those staples in place, which will make it a lot easier to work with this assembly, or this end I should say. I'm going to go around these staples here that hold it in place. So just getting close to those staples. Okay, so this should make it easier for us to work with the next part. Now what I want to do is I want to inspect everything and look for where there are the most wrinkles. Here at this corner, this isn't going to be a problem. We're going to be able to tension that beautifully, as you can see. Same thing with this corner. Everywhere here is good. Here's the worst part. See all the wrinkles here? So this is what I'm going to work on first before I do anything else. And I am pretty happy with its position of how it's laying. So I'm just going to work these wrinkles out slowly and draw the fabric taut. Put a few more temporary staples in here, just so I can inspect things. Definitely have a big wrinkle here, which means this staple is going to need to be removed because it's causing that wrinkle. That's why I put these in crooked and don't put them in straight. It's easy to remove them. If you put them in straight, you can still remove them. I'm going to draw the fabric taut. Hopefully that looks good on the top. We'll take a look at it here in a second. Temporary staples. Make sure we're happy with that. I am. Wrinkle here. Remove some of these. Use needle nose or pliers to get these out. Make sure they don't go on your table because you don't want to hurt your vinyl. Put them on the floor or in the trash. See how they're being worked out? We have a few little wrinkles here, but that'll actually come out with steam heat or a heat gun if you're careful. While we're stapling around the perimeter, I'm probably going to be able to pull those out even more, but we pretty much have all this worked out so that it's going to lay nice and neat even to the sides. So we're going to work on this corner here. So we're going to staple with permanent staples now. So I'm going to go for a pleasing look here, make sure everything's nice and smooth. I think that looks pretty good. We'll be able to get this out. Pretty confident of it. So I'm going to go close to the edge. And definitely we're good here. I'm going to get this down. I'm going to push hard. There's a lot of bulk here. Let's do another one right in the flange, like that. So now we'll work to the opposite corner and get it in position. I might have to remove some of these staples. I still have more wrinkles than I like, but we can do that. That looks good. Okay, so now we have all the staples out and we have the corners secured. I'm going to work to the middle and I'm going to put my permanent staples in here. So pull it tight, make sure you're happy with the way it looks. It looks great. I'll put some staples here. Then I'm going to work kind of in the middle of this section here and pull this snug. See, we have almost all those wrinkles worked out there. That looks good. Then I'll work to the middle of this one and we'll pull it snug. Make sure we're happy. Looks good. A little bit of a wrinkle there, so I'm kind of distributing it a little bit. I think what I'll do is I'll start from this end, moving the vinyl, making sure the wrinkles are on the top side or bottom side. And I'll work over here, distribute the wrinkles, make them small if you have to, just make sure they're back to the back side. Got one big one there, but it's on the back side. So keep going. Get this one out just by stapling right like that. Now we still have a few wrinkles here. That's going to come out with steam. Now here, we didn't do this piping here. I'm going to pull this piping so it looks good. And if you see any seams, you can actually roll the piping one direction to kind of hide any stitches or so forth that you may see in the piping. Sometimes you can see that if it's not close enough to your piping, so you can roll it left or right. This is actually pretty good, so it looks good like that. So I'm going to pull on this piping firmly, roll it a little bit to this side because I see more stitches on this side than I do on that side. And I'm going to put some stitches or some staples here and then into the piping, pushing really hard because it's thick. And then I'll just continue on around the perimeter, making sure that I'm happy with it as I go. Okay, before we get to this corner, I'm going to stop stapling shy of it, and I'm going to go ahead and fasten the corner with no wrinkles in our area here, and there are none. My seam's in the right spot, I believe. I better check that. Oh yeah, we are good. So now we'll take out all these temporary staples and then cut very close to the staples around the perimeter. Ooh, that's thick. Oof. These are the vent holes on the bottom side, and I have silk film covering them, so I'm going to make a few cuts in my silk film, and then I'm going to pull some of that out. You may want to use some needle nose to do this, but this works pretty well. This way, I'm not going to pull all this out. I'm going to cut it, but now we have some foam exposed. We can actually tuck the silk film back and that little bit of tape. We'll do that to all these vent holes. Now, to keep from seeing these wrinkles along the front edge, because it does stick out over the Helm chair, I'm going to put cushion underlining on it. And we have one straight side, so I'm going to put that here because that's the most important edge. Now for this front edge, only the front edge, I'm going to hem the fabric back so it looks nice. And to do that, I'm going to crease it a little bit on the edge of the table. And first I'm going to crease it with my fingers here. Then I'm going to run it on the edge of the table to create a nice, crisp hem. We'll start at the middle. Right there. Here at the sides, I'm going to trim around the side a little bit and just tuck the sides too. I wasn't going to do that, but I think it'll look better because this does show a little bit. So I've folded it up to something that I think looks pretty good, like that. We just decided to hem it all while we were in the process. There we go. Oops, here's a few staples. Okay, the first thing we need to do is secure the seat and screw it onto the frame. We took a wire brush and some degreaser and cleaned the pedestal and then repainted it. So we poked a hole through the vinyl here because we covered the holes for this, but we found the hole, and there's one here too. Our Helm chair is now complete.
Got any wrinkles? We'll show you how to remove them with steam, and you must be careful doing it.
Hopefully you can see that there are a few little small wrinkles at this location only. It seems like everywhere else is good. Can you see those in the camera? Barely, okay. Here's a hot steam. It's basically just a clothing steamer. Watch what happens. When using heat to take wrinkles out of any vinyl fabric, too much can cause damage to the vinyl, whether it be a dry heat or a steam heat. You can discolor the vinyl, or you can actually take the embossing out of the vinyl if it's not done carefully. So do this at your own risk. Those things are gone instantly. You can see here there are a few little they're not really wrinkles, there's just a little bit of a fullness in the fabric. I'm going to use hot steam and see if I can get those out. You'll find that most professionals use steam heat and sometimes dry heat to remove wrinkles. It is very customary. It's just done carefully. That looks much better. Amazing what hot steam can do for vinyl fabrics.
The Helm chair, or sometimes referred to as Captain's chair, is now complete.
Don't go away. The materials list and the tools list is coming up next. It is only through your loyal support that these free videos are made available. Thanks for your loyal support. And be sure to subscribe to the Say It Right YouTube channel. Click the bell to be notified of new videos when they become available. Thanks.
And now the materials list and the tools list, and also the amount of materials that we used to make this Helm chair. We used a premium 4-way stretch vinyl called Sunbrella Horizon, available at Say It Right. Shown in yellow is the amount of materials that we used for this single Helm chair. If you have any questions about the materials that we used or other types of materials, please be sure to give us a call or email us. We're glad to help. For more free videos like this, be sure to check out the Say It Right website or subscribe to the Say It Right YouTube channel. It is only through your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos available. Thanks for your loyal support. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.